How 47 American genius brains were outsmarted by Vietnamese guerrillas. It was supposed to be America's technological masterpiece in the Vietnam War. The Pentagon poured over $1 billion, assembled dozens of the nation's top scientists and military engineers, and crafted what they proudly called the electronic barrier known to history as the McNamara Line. Designed to stop North Vietnamese troops and supplies from flowing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this marvel of Cold War engineering would use seismic sensors, acoustic detectors, radar, and computers to create a wall of surveillance so tight that not even a single bicycle could pass unnoticed. At least, that was the plan. What followed instead was one of the most embarrassing defeats of military technology in modern history. Those 47 so-called genius brains underestimated the very thing that had defined the Vietnamese resistance all along. Ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a sharp understanding of their enemy's overconfidence. The result, what was meant to be an impenetrable wall, turned into a laughingstock. Not only did the barrier fail to stop the flow of troops and weapons, but the Vietnamese forces also learned how to use it against the Americans themselves. The McNamara Line, America's high-tech dream, named after U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The line was conceived in the mid-1960s when the war was going badly, unable to defeat the guerrilla tactics of the North Vietnamese. Washington turned to what it believed was its true advantage: science and technology. The idea was simple: if the Ho Chi Minh Trail could not be bombed out of existence, then America would build an electronic wall across Laos and South Vietnam to monitor and destroy everything that moved. Sensors hidden in the jungle would detect movement. Computers at a central command center would analyze the data, and bombers would be dispatched with pinpoint precision to obliterate the targets. In the imagination of the Pentagon, it was foolproof. How could peasants with sandals made from old tires and rifles from the 1940s possibly stand against satellites, computers, and jet bombers? But that question would be answered swiftly and humiliatingly. Vietnamese countermeasures. Outsmarting the barrier. From the moment the electronic fence was deployed, Vietnamese soldiers and engineers studied it with a mix of curiosity and mockery. What the Americans believed was a cutting-edge security system turned out to be surprisingly easy to trick. Trick 1. Tying the sensors together. Many of the acoustic and seismic sensors had long antenna whiskers that detected vibrations or sounds. The simplest countermeasure, Vietnamese troops simply walked up to them and tied the whiskers together, disabling them instantly. With one piece of string, the million-dollar device became useless. Trick 2. Using animals. Farm animals, especially oxen, were used to drag logs or rocks past sensors, creating false alarms. The Americans, sitting at their control centers, believed columns of trucks were moving. They scrambled bombers, wasting fuel and munitions, only to hit empty stretches of jungle. Trick 3. Fake convoys. Sometimes, entire dummy convoys were created. Soldiers banged on pots, dragged metal objects, and deliberately tripped sensors to mimic the sounds of trucks. The U.S. military would unleash massive bombing runs, only to flatten trees while the real supply convoys quietly moved along a different path. Trick 4. Turning bombs into bulldozers. Perhaps the most brilliant tactic was using the Americans' own firepower against them. By triggering false alarms, Vietnamese troops lured U.S. planes to bomb areas thick with jungle and obstacles. Once the smoke cleared, the bomb craters and destroyed vegetation created ready-made roads. In other words, the McNamara Line didn't stop Vietnamese soldiers, it helped pave their way south. The irony of high-tech versus low-tech. The Americans had trusted technology. They believed that sensors, satellites, and computers could outthink human ingenuity. But the Vietnamese proved once again that low-tech creativity could defeat high-tech arrogance. One side had computers worth millions. The other side had bamboo poles, buckets, and clever decoys. Yet the bamboo beat the computer. Even worse, the McNamara Line consumed billions of dollars, tied up resources, and gave Washington false confidence in its ability to control the battlefield. Every sensor planted in the jungle was another reminder of how little America understood its enemy. Propaganda gold. For the Vietnamese, the failure of the McNamara Line was more than just a tactical victory. It was a propaganda triumph. Newspapers in Hanoi gleefully reported that America's most advanced technologies had been defeated by peasants in sandals. Stories spread of villagers laughing at the expensive gadgets left scattered in the jungle, while soldiers joked that the Americans are building toys for us to play with. Meanwhile, back in Washington, officials avoided discussing the line in public. What had been billed as a war-winning strategy quietly faded into obscurity, remembered only as one of the greatest military embarrassments of the Vietnam War. Billions wasted in the jungle for the Pentagon. The McNamara Line was not just an experiment, it was a bottomless pit for American tax dollars. By the late 1960s, the United States had invested more than $1 billion equivalent to nearly $10 billion today into the project. Each sensor cost thousands of dollars, each aerial drop required fuel-hungry aircraft, and each false alarm meant squadrons of expensive bombers were dispatched. In theory, this investment was supposed to save lives by preventing enemy infiltration. In practice, it drained America's war chest while doing nothing to stop the steady flow of troops and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Every time a bomb was dropped on an empty stretch of jungle or a herd of oxen, Washington lost more money, credibility, and patience. The irony was brutal. The United States, with all its wealth, was bleeding itself dry against an opponent who used wooden carts, bicycles, and clever tricks to win the logistical war. Frustration in the U.S. ranks for American pilots and soldiers tasked with enforcing the McNamara Line. The system quickly became a source of frustration. Pilots were ordered to bomb confirmed targets based on sensor readings, only to return with gun camera footage of destroyed trees and empty jungle paths. Ground troops who stumbled upon discarded sensors found them tampered with in absurdly simple ways: wires tied together, batteries removed, or devices covered in mud. Some soldiers even admitted that the system made them feel foolish. One Air Force officer reportedly said, "We thought we were fighting ghosts in the jungle. Every time we hit a target, nothing was there." Behind closed doors, military analysts began to admit the unthinkable. The Vietnamese were not just avoiding the sensors, they were manipulating them at will. The Vietnamese spirit of ingenuity. For the soldiers and villagers along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the McNamara Line became less a threat and more a challenge, even a game. Veterans later recalled how squads would compete to see who could disable sensors the fastest, or who could generate the funniest false convoy to trick the Americans. Some of the most common tricks included buckets of water dripping onto metal to mimic the sound of engines, logs dragged by buffalo to imitate trucks moving at night, children sent to play near sensors, their laughter and footsteps triggering alarms that sent bombers flying overhead. In one particularly creative stunt, a unit hung empty, tin cans filled with pebbles from trees. When the wind blew, the rattling sounded like trucks moving in formation. The Americans, convinced they had intercepted a convoy, launched strike after strike, wasting bombs on nothing but forest air. These moments highlight a key truth for every genius device America dropped. The Vietnamese found a genius way to turn it into a joke, using the enemy's bombs to build roads. Perhaps the most devastating countermeasure of all was turning the U.S. bombing campaigns to Vietnam's advantage. By deliberately triggering false alarms, Vietnamese troops directed American planes to bomb areas filled with dense jungle or rough terrain. Once the dust settled, the craters and cleared paths became perfect routes for trucks, bicycles, and foot soldiers. In effect, The Americans were building the very roads their enemy needed to win the war. What was intended as a blockade became an unintentional construction project carried out by the U.S. Air Force at enormous expense. One veteran later quipped, "The Americans thought they were stopping us. In reality, they were paving the way for our victory." The psychological blow technology had long been America's pride. From nuclear weapons to space exploration, the United States believed its superiority in science guaranteed superiority in war. But the failure of the McNamara Line sent shockwaves through the U.S. military establishment. If the world's most advanced technology could be undone by tying a few wires together, what did that say about America's strategy? If billions of dollars could be wasted chasing phantom trucks in Buffalo, what hope was there of winning against an enemy who refused to fight on predictable terms? The McNamara Line revealed not only a tactical failure, but also a deeper cultural misunderstanding. Washington believed wars could be won with machines. Hanoi understood wars were won with people, their creativity, endurance, and unshakable willpower. The silent erasure. Because of its humiliating outcome, the McNamara Line was rarely discussed publicly in the United States after the war. Official reports quietly buried the details, labeling it a failed experiment. Few Americans today even know it existed. In Vietnam, however, it became part of the proud narrative of resistance. School children learned how their fathers and grandfathers had defeated the electronic wall. Veterans told stories of playing tricks on the machines. The tale lived on as proof that no amount of foreign money or technology could suppress a nation fighting for its independence. Conclusion: the lesson of 47 brains. In the end, the McNamara Line was less a military barrier and more a symbol of arrogance. 47 brilliant American minds believed they had solved the war with science. Yet in the jungles of Vietnam, their machines were tied up with string, outsmarted by buffalo, and mocked by the very peasants they were supposed to crush. It is one of history's great ironies, a billion-dollar fence, designed by geniuses, defeated by sandals, bamboo, and laughter. The story of the McNamara Line is more than just a footnote in the Vietnam War. It is a reminder that wars are not won by gadgets alone. They are won by human spirit. And in this case, that spirit belonged to the Vietnamese, who turned America's proudest invention into its most embarrassing defeat. The McNamara Line. A billion-dollar joke in the jungle. By the time the 1970s arrived, the truth was undeniable. The McNamara Line had failed. It had not just failed in some minor way, it had collapsed in the most humiliating fashion imaginable. Billions of US dollars, thousands of high-tech sensors, fleets of aircraft, and the brainpower of America's best and brightest had been poured into what was supposed to be an unbreakable electronic barrier. Yet, in the end, this barrier was mocked, dismantled, and even weaponized by the very people it was meant to stop. When genius meets bamboo, the Americans called it cutting-edge electronic warfare. The Vietnamese called it tying the beard. That phrase came from the simplest trick of all, when soldiers found sensors. They simply tied the wires together, buk rao lai, rendering the device useless. One flick of a hand, and thousands of dollars of U.S. technology turned into dead metal. Other times, they pulled out the batteries, dunked sensors in water, or buried them under layers of mud. It was almost too easy. Compare this: a Harvard-trained engineer in Washington spends months designing a seismic sensor to detect footsteps. Meanwhile, a Vietnamese teenager in sandals walks by, kicks dirt over it, and the million-dollar innovation goes silent forever, turning bombs into bulldozers. Perhaps the cruelest irony was how Vietnamese forces used the McNamara Line against its creators. By making fake noises and sending decoys past the sensors, they triggered alarms that sent American bombers rushing in. The U.S. Planes would unload their bombs on empty jungle, cratering the land and smashing trees. When the dust settled, the craters and blasted clearings became perfect roads for trucks and bicycles along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So, instead of blocking supply routes, the McNamara Line literally helped pave them. It was as if the Air Force had become an involuntary construction company, working night and day to expand Vietnam's transportation network. Billions lost, nothing gained. The numbers tell the story of absurdity. Over $1 billion invested, equivalent to nearly $10 billion today. Tens of thousands of sensors dropped, most quickly destroyed or fooled. Countless bombing runs wasted on oxen, empty roads, and children's footsteps. And the result? Supplies kept flowing south. Troops kept marching. The war dragged on. The McNamara Line stopped nothing. It delayed nothing. It only exposed the limits of American power when faced with a determined and inventive enemy. The psychological collapse. For the American military, the defeat was not just material, it was psychological. The U.S. had believed technology could solve anything. They believed wars could be won with machines, sensors, and computers. The Vietnamese proved otherwise. Every time a buffalo tricked a seismic sensor, every time a dripping bucket fooled a sound detector, every time a false signal sent millions of dollars worth of bombs crashing into empty forest, the myth of American superiority cracked a little more. The lesson was brutal brains in Washington meant nothing against ingenuity in the jungle. Why you've never heard of it? Ask an American today about the McNamara Line, and most will stare blankly. The project was quietly buried in military archives, written off as an unsuccessful experiment. Unlike B-52 raids or major battles, it is rarely mentioned in textbooks or documentaries. Why? Because it was humiliating. Because it revealed that the United States, the richest nation on earth, had been outsmarted by peasants in sandals with bamboo sticks. For Vietnam, however, the story became legend. Veterans told their children how they played tricks on American machines. The tale entered history as a symbol of resourcefulness and resilience. The final lesson. The McNamara Line was more than a technological failure. It was a warning. It showed that war cannot be reduced to engineering problems. It showed that no matter how advanced the weapons, they are useless without understanding the human spirit of the opponent. 47 of America's finest minds believed they could seal the Ho Chi Minh Trail with gadgets. Yet the trail remained open. Supplies kept flowing, and the war was eventually lost. The electronic wall of Vietnam stands today as one of history's greatest examples of military hubris. A wall designed to be impenetrable, undone by mud, laughter, and the simplest of tricks. Epilogue 47, Brains, defeated by one idea. If there is one image that captures the absurdity, it is this. On one side, rows of American engineers in clean offices, drawing blueprints for million-dollar sensors. On the other, a barefoot Vietnamese soldier, bending down to tie two wires together, smiling as the machine goes silent. 47 brains against one pair of hands, and the hands won.